Yeah, so welcome all. Great that we're back again. So we've been keeping it going monthly. I think we're up to our third, fourth webinar event at this stage. My name is Paddy O'Reilly, Chair of the Digital Transformation Lab in Cork University Business School. It's great to see the numbers rolling in, and I know we're clocking up very nice numbers again for this session. And we got three excellent speakers who I won't do them justice by introducing them, so I'll let Jeremy, as our host, Jeremy Hayes, Cork University Business School, take over and let I suppose Anna, David and Haydn introduce themselves. So
my name is Anna, and I don't want to make you too envious, but I'm joining you from sunny Lisbon today. And what am I? Well, I have a computer science degree, but I've since gone rogue. So I've gone into the soft side where I'm really passionate to see how technology can help to enhance interactions that boost learning and knowledge sharing between people, mostly inside organizations. But I'm also really passionate to see how these things can be used in society around the defense of human rights, but mostly around democracy and connecting citizens with government.
So, Haydn Shaughnessy, my background is in technology and business, so I've done a lot of work around imagining new applications for new technologies. And on the back of that, did quite a lot of work in America for American think tanks and American enterprises, trying to look 2 or 3 years or sometimes 5 years ahead for them. So, for example, when mobile first started to be prevalent, what were the implications of that for the American enterprise would be the kind of thing that I would be working on. More recently, though, I've written books on platforms and ecosystems, platform business models, and also on techniques for business transformation and tools for business transformation.
Good afternoon, everybody from Dublin. So I'm David, and I'm an author, a speaker, consultant. My main interest is in driving awareness of new technologies and helping people understand what they can actually really deliver. So cutting through the hype and the rubbish, and really finding the solutions that take business problems and technology solutions and find the right way, the pragmatic way forward.
Great stuff. So I saw a quote from Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft. It was probably 3 or 4 months ago now. And he said, in the last 2 months, we've had 2 years of digital transformation. And in terms of your interest in organizational learning, like, what do you think about that? Like, I mean, how much has the world transformed despite of COVID, or maybe accelerated by COVID?
Yeah, I would say that at this stage, it's mostly because of COVID. I think what this pandemic has put upon us, upon organizations, is this need to make things work when working remotely. And I always thought that was possible. I've been working from my home for 9 years now, so I know it's perfectly okay. Actually, the last few months, certainly when the kids were still at school, was almost everything but home working, to be honest, because it was a bit of chaos. But it has certainly made it possible for organizations, to realize that it is possible, and also they were forced to put or shape the platforms so that this kind of work was possible. So I think it's not a given that things will stay this way when the pandemic is over and the home working thing is required. But I certainly think that the tools will be in place, and many people and many organizations would have tasted the benefits of having their people work from home. It's not just positives, there's negatives as well, but they've seen it is possible, and I think that's a big plus.
I suppose, David, I mean, I guess, like, you've written recently about kind of the future of retail. Like, retail has been transformed by this pandemic. So kind of like, can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I mean, little did I know. So the first week in March, I published my last book, and it was called When Humans Stop Shopping. And, you know, literally 2 weeks later, humans had stopped shopping. So it wasn't what I intended. I can't claim I saw it all coming, but it was, I think the main point is around that acceleration now, that we expected things to change. People were slowly changing their habits, migrating more and more online, and then suddenly it's all gone online for a lot of industries. So it's a question now of who can cope, who can adapt the best. And I think, you know, there's a lot of good talk and a lot of good intention around digital transformation and that, but the proof now is in who's flexible enough to actually adapt to the situation, who can put in place the systems to solidify the kind of emergency measures that they've had to impose in the last few months, and who can actually now adapt and turn that into a business operation going forward and manage the consumer experience and say, you know, we've been through very difficult times, but how do we actually look for those positive consumer trends that are going to start to emerge and prepare business to be ready, not just to survive, because at the moment everyone's in survival mode, and we need to actually push through that and get to an actual more efficient operational mode than people are in right now.
Kind of a platform and ecosystem point of view, like where do you see this trend heading?
I don't really see that platform and ecosystem model having a particular impact on what's happening around COVID. But just to add to what's been said, I think that most companies have accelerated some decision making, but they haven't accelerated any decision making around the complexity that they've created for themselves over the last 40 years. So I think by and large, most companies are in as much trouble today as they were 6 months ago, 9 months ago. And I think there is a critical moment coming up where this kind of designed complexity is going to trip a lot of companies up.
A few aspects relating to that. One of them is I do believe that because we're so connected nowadays, that this network effect has made that the virus has spread a lot quicker than it would have been a few years ago. But I also believe that the network will be the answer. So because it's the fact that we're connected, that we have created our networks and some good connections, and we do have tools to support these interactivity and interactions, that we will be able to together solve this problem around the pandemic. And that is down to the community spirit that you mentioned, and the fact that people are now more used to work collectively across boundaries, be they geographical or racial or in terms of areas. I think there's another thing that, and picking up on something that David mentioned, although he was obviously talking about the systems as in terms of the market, I do feel that we now have the tools, and organizations are certainly better prepared now than they were in the beginning of the year with the tools. However, I do miss the culture and the right behaviors to make these things work, and the skills are not there yet. Leaders still need to learn how to lead and manage people in this kind of context. Networks and communities will be crucial and are crucial, but leaders need to know how to operate. We do need network leaders or digital leaders, or however you want to call them, people who are capable to embrace the power of the network, not the network in the sense of the tools, but of how people connect with each other. And leaders need to know how to deal with that and embrace that as an opportunity.
Well, it's difficult to comment on these things if we're only commenting on the COVID context. I think that network effects are grossly exaggerated. I think that they're very rare and they tend to happen in communications platforms more than anything else. And what we do have is we are all on a network. So rather than network effects, there is an effect of being on a network. I'm not sure that that's being utilized, even if it wasn't for COVID. So let's try and broaden out beyond that. I think that what most organizations do is ignore the power of the collective. And that's just a function of a past kind of hierarchical organization and flows of knowledge, or lack of flows of knowledge. But if you think about what the amount of information we have around us in this network world does, it actually makes it very difficult for us to know very much. We have so much information, it is overabundant and impossible for us to interpret. And I think that's again, one of the problems that businesses face, because then they'll just go and grab hold of the next fad. If somebody at MIT says, you need to be a platform, they'll say, we are a platform. So I think that to get a real strong handle on what collective intelligence means, we have to go back to how it originated, how the idea originated. And really it was about the fact that information is so abundant, the only way we're going to make good decisions is if we organize ourselves collectively to interpret and shape the flow of information towards good outcomes, with an acknowledgement that much of that is very, as it were, transient. You know, we never get fixed points, we never get the certainties. We just shape knowledge as we go. And I think if we can get back to that idea, we then need to start thinking, well, how do we do that when we don't meet? Because you generally need venues of some kind. So I think that, you know, for me, it is, we have too much information, we have too much data around us. We have now lost the ability to get together and collectively forge that into useful outcomes. And we urgently need to learn how to use networks to do collective intelligence properly.
Written a lot about artificial intelligence. So kind of like, can you see if there's a solution to some of the problems Haydn brings up there?
So I think, I mean, what I'm always reminded at the moment about the best boss that I ever worked for gave me very simple advice. He told me that, you know, there were 3 things that any business should worry about. And that was people, detail, and focus. And he said, like, they're the 3 crucial things to put in place before you start turning to technology for your solution. So if you've got the right people, you understand the detail of your market, the detail of your customers, and then you're able to focus all your collective efforts on that. That is what you're going to need before you then say what tools are available. I mean, even though, yeah, I write a lot about AI and lecture on the topic, I always caution people and say, you know, AI is not a destination. You don't just say, oh, we need AI. You have to say, we have a problem that we believe can be solved by applying these technologies in our context for a specific purpose. And I think it's always depressing when you see, you know, people rushing to say, oh, we need to do AI, because that's meaningless. It's about finding the technologies that help your business, that deliver the real solutions, rather than, you know, picking the latest buzzword and saying we must have some of that and we must implement it, without actually having an end game and without having the people organized around it, so that everyone in the organization understands why you're doing this, what you're trying to achieve, rather than saying, oh, it's the latest buzzword, we need to do this.
One thing we fail to acknowledge is that most companies don't know what's going on inside them. You know, most executive teams don't know what's going on inside their companies. They don't understand the operating model that drives their business or supports their business. So I think you can kind of posit rational ways of doing things, but most firms are deeply irrational. And they're irrational because they've changed frequently over the last 40 years. They've accumulated a lot of technology that they don't really know how to integrate with more modern technology. So that's why I think you need to be thinking of things like, well, that's why we wrote transformation sprints. You know, we think, for example, that you have to simplify internal systems very, very quickly. Most companies, for example, one of the questions that came around before is, what does it take to become a platform company? Most companies don't stand a chance. the best that they can do is simplify and get simplification programs in place so they can actually function efficiently. As an example, we reckon in most companies we go into, there's at least 25, 30% wasted projects on the portfolio. And you'll see that time and time again. So simple message is most executive teams don't know what's going on in the side of their business. They don't understand how it functions.
Is there some sort of solution to kind of the problems that Haydn is talking about?
I don't know if it's a solution, but there's something that Haydn mentioned that it's very dear to me, which is the fact that we do have a lot of information, we have a lot of data. And for me, the platforms are obviously required to make this data available to people. But most importantly, what I think it's really required, and that links to learning, is that organizations learn or acquire the habit of sharing their decision-making process, like almost working in the narrative, saying what data they're using and how they're using it and how they're putting it together and how they're creating new information and generating new knowledge and using that to back up their decision-making. Because the data will be there, and it will be accessible. What is really important and what keeps the organization going and being able to innovate and rethink and adapt more efficiently is not having to duplicate the work, reinvent the wheel, duplicate mistakes, and these documented knowledge and these documented decision-making is really important. And I don't mean writing long reports about it. It's not what I mean. It's really working in the narrative. It's about having the platforms where you can just go in there and write something to the rest of the organizations or the groups that you're working with more closely. This is what we've decided because of A, B, and C, and we decided not to do this because of D. And this is just, if nothing else, it gives someone in a year's time a reference and who to go to get more information about that decision. And this is how you start to build a network. And this is a new way of working as well. And that's where what I mentioned earlier about having leaders that are open to this scrutiny, open to this transparent way of working, but also very much open to this engaging way of working. And there aren't many leaders like that at the moment. Because the other thing is, when you're sharing this decision, this process out loud and sharing that with the rest of the people you're working with, you're actually also making it possible for people to come to you and say, did you consider this? I've worked in another organization, or I've tried something different and it worked or it didn't work. So you really start to use the wisdom of the crowd in a way that you probably did not anticipate, and without making it a burden or a very structured process, which sometimes hinders more than helps.
Any tips to ensure those wasted projects don't get onto the portfolio in the first place? So maybe that's one for Haydn, I think.
Yeah, I think that most of those projects, well, there's a number of reasons why those projects get there. Some are just pet projects. And you sometimes CEOs just launching projects without any kind of evaluation. So there are those reasons. But I think that also the whole lean startup movement has done a lot of damage to companies because it's told them that they need to start a lot of projects, but it hasn't really told them how to sift them out and how to get rid of those that don't belong on the portfolio wall. So I think that what we're lacking at the moment is some kind of a method, and I think that in Flow we have this method, that sits between old-fashioned R&D, which used to be, if you remember, not sure about permanent TSB, but organizations like Philips would employ philosophers and sociologists and anthropologists, and they would constantly be looking at how society is evolving and what's the relationship between people and technologies, what new needs are emerging. And they would kind of pace that back from a 7-year horizon to a 3-year horizon to an 18-month horizon. And then you're into product development. But today companies are launching projects on the back of an ideation campaign. And so you might have 20 or 30 projects that you're trying to make them work when they don't belong in between there is a new value discovery methodology, I think, that good companies use. And I think that the kind of companies I'm thinking of would be Amazon and Netflix, where they have very, very complex segmentations of their market. So they understand the long tail, they understand the detail of what's going on in those markets and don't treat it as one. In doing that, and just as an example, Netflix's taste communities, it has 1,300 taste communities that it regards as its market. What it then does, and what companies like Amazon does, is say, it's not only that we need to start innovating for those segments and see if those segments scale out, but we need to do our UX design and our CX design for those segments, because there's no longer a mass market. So the segmentation starts to drive your product portfolio, and it starts to drive how you interact with customers and the kind of technology designs you take on. There are very, very few companies doing that, but that's the way forward.
Any kind of recommendations in terms of digital leadership then, in terms of the challenges that Anna and Haydn have raised?
So I think a lot of it comes down to awareness. So I think companies aren't necessarily making reasonable decisions. They're not aware of what's going on in their marketplace. They're not aware of what's going on in the broader space. They're not aware of what technology can and can't deliver. And as Haydn says, you know, they hold some kind of internal idea generation campaign and say, oh, great, we've got 30 ideas. You have to focus. You have to say, what can we do? What can we actually get value from and deliver on reasonably? How do we look? I think one of the things that people are very slow to do now is partner. You know, companies tend to keep to themselves too much. They're not, I don't know whether it's down to an ego thing where they actually just won't look outside to find people who are good at complementary things and make those alliances so that they can grow more than they can achieve on their own. So I think you've got to have that focused approach to what projects you can do, be willing to invest, be willing to fail, because that's something that, you know, Amazon certainly are very good at doing, is saying, you know, they have their process where you have to pitch your idea internally in Amazon to get support as a press release. You're not allowed pitch as a PowerPoint deck. If you're holding a meeting in Amazon, there has to be a spare empty chair to represent the customer at every meeting. They leave a chair spare to remind you who you're actually focusing on. So I think it's that process of saying, you know, are we picking the right projects? Are we picking the right partners? Are we always remembering the consumer? And have we actually looked at what's going on in the world? I mean, probably one of the biggest challenges that I've seen in most businesses is they're so obsessed about the detail of operational challenges. How are they going to, you know, get to Monday's management report, rather than actually taking the time to say, are we preparing ourselves for the competition that's coming? Are we ready for the future? It's so reactive, it's so short term, and it's hard, but they have to find more time to sit back and think, are we working on the right projects? Do we know our customers? The number of businesses that I've seen where they just make such fundamental mistakes. You know, they've done a lot of the hard work. You know, they've moved online, they've bought or built a platform, but then, you know, they don't offer any delivery options quicker than a week, or they have a return policy that's just out of kilter with the market. So it's that balance between how do we innovate without actually messing up the basics.
A lot of the open innovation work has come from open source software, which was kind of a little bit more focused, and you can kind of like do this thing, whereas kind of like, you know, kind of looking for the bigger, you know, kind of problems might be a bigger thing.
Well, I think when Procter & Gamble started open innovation, going back to about 2001 now, they were very focused. They would say things like, we want a cold water enzyme that will allow people to wash white clothes at 40 degrees. Who's going to give it to us? So I think that at that stage, it was really companies that had a very clear idea of where the next competitive advantage lay. Who knows quite how it's gone in the bizarre direction that it's gone now. But already in 2010, I remember running one of these ideation platform programs, and there were 1,500 ideas. And it literally took months to tell 1,496 people no. And that's the kind of mess that people got into. And I think it is going back to things like lean startup, you know, this whole idea of fail fast, fail cheap, really small projects and grow them. Yes, those are great things. They sort of replicate what a startup might do, but 95% of startups fail. So why would you base your enterprise methodology on something with a 95% failure rate?
And just a question that's come in there in the chat is some people have said, what is your definition of an ecosystem or a platform? So maybe starting with you, Haydn, first, and then reverting back to the other panelists.
Sure. So I think of a platform as being the enablers of a certain type of business activity. So it might be things like the ingest system for apps. So how do I get apps into my platform? And that's partly a technology thing and partly a policy thing. So if you look at something like the App Store and the Android stores, they're very much about trying to do that without detailed individual legal contracts. It was all done under terms and conditions. So the legal element and the actual technology element were the enablers. Transaction engines are part of the platform because they are also an enabler of financial processes. I tend to think of the ecosystem as being somewhat accidental to the platform. Other people would argue that the ecosystem is these two sides of the market. So the driver and the passenger in a Uber context, or the host and a renter in Airbnb. But I think if you look at something like Airbnb, what happened very quickly once a few billion were thrown at Airbnb and it started to rise in this meteoric way that it did, there then began to be things like a number of letting management software vendors that were targeted solely at people who were doing Airbnb and enabled those people to expand their Airbnb enterprises. There was key handling services being run out of India to keep the costs down. There were conferences being run, training programs for Airbnb. None of that was run by Airbnb. None of that touched the Airbnb platform either. So that's the big difference, I think. If you've got a platform and you've got the right enablers in place, you're only halfway there. Somehow you need to encourage this other set of people, these other communities, that there's something in it for them. That's your ecosystem.
I actually read that question and I think it's a really good one because when I was looking at the title for this conversation and the expertise that the three of us are bringing into the conversation, I immediately noticed as a different take on what platform is, because when I'm talking about platforms, and I totally get what Haydn is saying and I totally agree with it, that within my context of work and the work I do on a daily basis, the platform that I talk about are the collaboration and communication platforms that you will see in organizations. So things like SharePoint, Office 365, or Workplace, or Jive, or Connections, something like that. And it really fascinates me how they can really enable the way people work. So the idea of platform and as an enabler is present in both definitions, but the context and what we're talking about is really different.
Right, David?
So I think I get a little bit concerned sometimes when people focus on platform singular, because I think in most businesses, you're going to need platforms. You're going to need to interact with a number of these enablers. I mean, everybody's mentioned enablers, and I think that is the key about platform technologies enable you to build something. But in most cases, a business needs a number of them. So you need a payment platform. So you need a MasterCard or a Visa or a PayPal or a Stripe. You need a delivery platform if you're in the online sales business. So you need your logistics partners. And I think it's around combining a number of platforms in a coherent way and hopefully a differentiated way is how you can build an actual business. So it's putting together those platforms is a key part, I think, of building your own platform. It's made up of other components, And we mentioned Amazon as a great innovator already, but one of the things that I like around their approach is they have an internal rule that says anything that you build must have an API. So they don't allow any communication within their business that isn't via an API. So you have to be able to communicate programmatically and efficiently across their platforms so that the businesses are modular and you can take the particular services that you need. So I think that notion of services to build your platform is crucial. And then the ecosystem for me is where you broaden that out and you enable other people to come and plug into your platform and build that wider ecosystem, which, as Haydn says, can actually then go on to be self-sustaining without actually linking back to the original platform. It can build these extra little businesses that are related to, but no longer actually directly dependent on the host platform.
The question is about how they can appropriate the knowledge, or how they can.
Yes, across, kind of when it's so distributed. Yeah.
That is one of the biggest struggles at the moment, and I just put on a comment on the chat that, and picking up on what David was saying, that on a study that I carried out recently, 83% of the organizations are using a mix of tools just for collaboration and communication. So imagine the rest. So I'm totally with David when he says that there's not one platform, there's loads. And the fact that organizations are increasingly looking at different tools to make this communication and knowledge sharing available is also creating that problem of how can you get hold of the knowledge when you need it. And that's why I was early saying that for me, sharing knowledge is very rarely about documenting everything in a very structured way, because it's very hard then to find that knowledge and find that information when you need it. It's very often about making your work visible, not in the sense that look at how good I am, but more in the sense that this is what I'm working on. Because people, you'll then start to create a profile and a recognition within your networks, and then this applies within the organization or within other sort of networks and communities. So you start to build your own profile, and people will know about you and that you are a person who works around X and Y. So when they need information, and if they're struggling to find the data and information and knowledge they need, they don't necessarily need to know what tool and platform to go to. They will probably just find a way of getting in touch with you and ask. And I do not think that's a bad thing. I think that's actually a very positive thing, because if someone comes to me, yes, the person may interrupt my work, but I will be able to give that person a lot more knowledge than the person will get from finding the document or the data or the report. I can give something which is very key, which is context. And that is, I think, the core of knowledge, and that's what really makes it different from the information and data that is so available nowadays.
One of the core skills now going forward is being able to manage those multiple sources in a coherent way, making sure that you have all the right sources. So not assuming that because you have a number of sources that they're the correct sources. So can you actually evaluate the quality of that data? Is it a quantity versus quality question? Have you the right sources? Have you the right tools then to actually manipulate and manage that data, extract the value from it, and make sure you're doing it in a compliant way, so you're respecting your privacy obligations, and that it's a difficult operational challenge for business. But rather than shy away from it, I think we need to acknowledge it's a requirement now to be able to manage those sources effectively and how you do that is going to be a differentiator for businesses. Can you gather the right sources? Can you then extract what you need from them, merge the data into meaningful and useful tools going forward?
Well, I've two comments on it. I think first of all, when you see how companies address their data strategies, they tend to build very big ones. So their data policy or data strategy will become a big data normalization problem, and that can run for 3 or 4 years. So we've tended to find that companies, when they approach these issues, it becomes yet another instance of kind of big project design. And you don't need to do that. Some of the most effective data projects are really small ones, because in the end, what you want is insight, not data. And you have as much data as you want. But if it doesn't give you an insight with a market advantage, no point. There's certainly no point waiting 3 or 4 years for data normalization. So I think that's one thing. I think in China, what you see now is that these platforms, particularly Alibaba and Tencent, are really data-driven organizations in a way which no Western company is. And what they've been able to do is to integrate all areas of business. I actually think it's a trend, and I think that the trend is emerging in Europe, perhaps more so than in the United States, actually, just thinking about relative competitive advantages. But if you look at what Alibaba's doing right now, it's trying to integrate all the retail outlets in all the major cities of China into its platform. And what it's doing is offering them a business operating system, so an operating model for local retail. And the reason it's doing that is that then a lot of what it has in terms of data about what's coming out of primary production in China, out of the farms all over China, or out of different manufacturing organizations, it can sort of interpret what people are buying on the street, as well as what people are buying on its own platform. And it can help to optimize the overall economic system, as you might expect in a socialist state. But it's really important, because what it does, it allows you to optimize a lot of your logistics in real time. It enables you to do much better route planning. It enables you to do much better timing of harvesting of fresh goods. And it allows you to make sure that the product is where the customers are going to be. So I think what we're seeing at one end is a fantastic end-to-end integrated service, which is all the way from where does something originate to where does it get consumed, all on one platform.
I guess as we're coming towards the end of the session, maybe just back to David first, and just give your thoughts about what the big trends are going to be in terms of platforms, business models, and ecosystems in the next, I was going to say 10 years, but no, probably should say like 6 months.
So I think, yeah, even 6 months feels a lot, doesn't it? I think the trends, as we've said, it's going to be the acceleration of what was already happening. So the move online, if you're not able to understand your customers and serve them online, you're in real trouble. Even if you're a small local business, you still need to be able to take that advantage and use it online. I think in terms of business models and that, I really would encourage people to consider the business models that they have critically and say, are they right? Are there new business models that they should be considering? You know, is it the move to subscription? So there's so many opportunities there where people never really considered subscription. They always thought that was something that you had for, you know, back in the days of magazines. But now, you know, you can subscribe to anything and everything. And it's your accountants will love it as an approach. So I think there's a lot of businesses who need to consider that offer of subscriptions, and you know, the move to secondhand is something we could spend hours talking about as well. The circular economy, people being much more aware of the social and environmental impact of what they do. So I think businesses need to be juggling all of those challenges to be ready for the future. And then the final one that, again, I could talk for hours on, is the move towards automated shopping. So the notion that people will actually start delegating some of their retail choices to replenishment services. And that has, you know, absolutely massive impact for businesses who aren't ready to meet automated consumers. And I think you need to be thinking about that. You need to be planning for it and seeing what changes are needed in your business as you get ready for that future, because it will come sooner than anybody thinks. And if we've learned anything from the last 6 months, it is a question now of, things change quicker than you expect, quicker than you want, and you've got to be ready for that. And if you've thought about the trends that are there, had a quick look around the world to see what's happening in other sectors, and get away from that mentality that I've come across in so many areas where people say, oh yeah, that won't happen in our industry. You've got to start seeing the potential for business models, business policies to come across the board. Consumers don't think in verticals, consumers don't think in channels, they think in what they need. And that means that your business, whichever sector you're in, has to be aware of what's going on and be ready for that then to come into your space.
Anna, maybe just coming from an organizational learning perspective then, kind of like, how do you see the impact of this?
Well, I'm not sure if this is how I see or how I would really like things to go from now on. I think this whole situation created this scenario where organizations had to go into survival mode and look at the tools that were available and implement them and make them accessible. That does not mean that people are really ready to embrace this new way and new context of working, and certainly leaders are still lagging behind on the most core skills. But the other thing is this survival mode has also made it that organizations that transpose the current way of working into the digital without really embracing the opportunity to rethink the way they work. And that means the culture and the behaviors and even the processes that they have in place. And they're not to blame for that. We really had to make things work. But now there's a really good opportunity now that the major crisis has gone, so we hope, and that they had time to put things or the wheel turning. Now it's a good time to look at what happened, how well and how badly prepared they were for this, and what they can do to use these same tools but in different ways. Very much like David was saying for business models, look internally how you can rethink your decision-making process, your go-to-market process, your marketing process. How can you promote better and more efficient learning and knowledge transfer? The other thing is with this whole thing, with people suddenly being taken away for the quarantine or the hospital or whatever, and in some organizations that meant a lot of people being taken away at the same time, it's really an opportunity for organizations to think critically about how they're retaining their critical knowledge and how they can create better ways for people, again, to work in the narrative and to share what they do and how they do it and the decisions they've made, so that if they're suddenly taken away to the hospital or whatever, their colleagues can pick up the work and continue and enhance the work. And I think that's very cool. And just out of curiosity, in the survey I mentioned earlier, 60% of participants the organizations say that the platforms they currently have for communication and collaboration are extremely useful or really useful or very useful. That was the expression. However, when you look at the way they're using it, they're just skimming the surface. They're just literally doing the basics. They're using these tools to facilitate online meetings and chats, which is probably not the best community and transparent way of working. And that's the kind of opportunity I think we're missing. And there's also another role for these platforms to help organizations, which is to bring people together and make sure that they are still engaged with the organization and with each other, even when working from home.
I think that's the same with platforms. You know, I think people are sort of saying, look, I quack, can I be a duck? And so suddenly you're a platform, you know, and the thing is, business has already moved beyond platforms. Platform and ecosystem model is already old. We were writing about that in 2005, 2006. What's now happening is that companies are integrating services across a whole chain of value. And I mentioned that in respect to Alibaba, but if you look at BMW as an example, BMW now owns transit management software so that it can get involved in urban transit management. It owns Nokia's old mapping software. It's the second most important mapping database in the world here. It owns Free Now, so it's into ride hailing. It does parking management, parking location. There are billions wasted every year through people looking for parking spaces. So a company like BMW, I think, is in the forefront of what we're seeing from China. What's happening in China is being taken up by BMW in Europe. So in this particular case, I don't think we're necessarily lagging the US. But I think what it signals is that actually the business model is no longer the important point of focus for us. The operating model is. In order to do the things that BMW wants to do, it intends to have 50% of its employees become software developers. So if it now has 30,000 people, ultimately within the next 5 years, I believe, there'll be 15,000 software developers, because that's how you do this integration. All that integration is about software and services. And that's about an operating model change. There are business model changes along the way. Yes, you can do subscriptions and all kinds of recurring revenues, but unless you're able to remodel your business, unless you're actually able to sit down and say, probably we're not going to need those auto engineers, we're probably going to need this other group. How do we get 15,000 of the best software developers in the world in the next 5 years? Well, that requires a kind of partnering strategy that we've never had before. So it signals a lot of things that you've got to do differently. And I think that the platform and ecosystem model was always a kind of a lazy thing. You know, it was all about, well, let's get those network effects and by golly, we'll scale. Look at the platforms and ecosystems that are out there that look like the models. Uber, 12 billion of VC investment. There's one reason why the platform and ecosystem model worked with Uber and Airbnb. Billions and billions of dollars from a society that's got nowhere to put money. What companies are really doing, though, is moving away from that and going to this integration model. And I think it says things like, can you afford to think of yourself as just a bank? No way. There's no way you're going to survive as a bank. You have to be a financial service along with a lot of other services. Or can you think of yourself as just an energy company? No, no, no. You have to think about all the utility needs that your customer base has got. And you've got to serve those across the whole value chain. So that's my takeaway from, you know, the review of the kind of work that we do and the stuff that I've been writing on. Platforms and ecosystems are yesterday's model. Integration is where it's going.
Finally, then we'll go in alphabetical order with Anna, David, and Haydn. Haydn just raised a very interesting question to someone who has spent 20 years studying and researching business models, saying that the business model is less important than the operating model. So maybe Anna, you know, kind of maybe your comments on that.
I'm not too sure, I have to say. I think that the operational model is key. You need to know how to run your company and the kind of skills you need and how you're going to use your talent and the knowledge you have to make things work. But you also need to know where you're going. And yes, you can think about it as strategy, but it's also taken from the model you're using for your business. So I do think that the business model needs to be sorted. The organization needs to know how they want to operate, and then they will define the operation model. And that for me is very much linked to the knowledge, the tools, and everything, as you can expect. That's my hat. Yes, every work I do with organizations, the first thing I ask is about the strategy and how do you want to operate, and what kind of markets you're tapping into and what kind of clients you're liaising with, because that also gives you a very good sense of the knowledge that you need, and then you can start looking at what's missing and how you can mobilize the available knowledge and how you can create the required knowledge.
David?
So maybe I'm a bit old school the way I approach it, but I don't see a distinction between the operating model and the business model. I see no benefit in having a great operating model if it's not profitable. So I like to focus on, are you running the business properly? Are you growing? Are you scaling? Are you flexible? Are you responsive? Are you in touch with what's happening? And are you doing all that profitably? So I'm not wedded to a distinction between an operating model and a business model. I think you need to operate a profitable business model or else you're doing something wrong. So I look at the whole picture and say, is it a good business? Is it well run? Is it ready for the future? And is it profitable? And if not, when will it be profitable? So, Haydn's examples of, the massive investments and the cash burn of some of the poster children of new businesses. I have the said slightly old school view of, when I went to business school, you were told you needed to have profitability, or at least a route to profitability. So I like to look at that and say, is there a clear path to profitability in this? And is it something we can then sustain because our operating model is efficient and has vision and has a management who are ready to experiment and are putting their money into the right projects?
Would you like to sum up on that question?
Well, I now I've forgotten what the question is, but I can say a few things about, I think, take a company like, well, first of all, of course you have to make money. The reason most companies aren't doing a great deal of the integration that I talked about is because they're technologically not capable of doing it. And the reason a lot of companies waste a lot of money or waste a lot of resources is because of technological complexity that's grown over time. We've been told there are solutions to this, it's big data or it's platforms and ecosystems. I just want to illustrate the illusion of the platform model. Apple was the poster child before Uber and before Airbnb. And let's remember, Uber is $12 billion worth of investment. But Apple has never made more than 7% of its revenues from its app store. So what was the model for this new platform and ecosystem business only ever accounted for maximum 7%. Last year, Apple had secured 35% of the global wearables market, and that market doubled in that year. So in a market that's growing 100% a year, Apple owns 35% of it. It's not a platform. It's an incredibly good hardware company that has incredible software services. And most of those software services are going to be around things like health. So again, a little example. We do a lot, medicine does a lot to try and diagnose us in different ways through machinery, through blood tests, through colonoscopies and these types of things. But what South Korean doctors have found is that anybody who's got particular kinds of cancers is likely to have an elevated heart rate, an elevated resting heart rate. I'm wearing an Apple Watch. Apple can tell me if I've got an elevated resting heart rate. I don't even need to go to a doctor. If my heart rate is elevated by 20 beats a minute for the next 3 or 4 weeks, I know there's something wrong. And I think what these companies are doing, and this is why I say that where you have to look is this kind of, the way in which they cross the boundaries of industries and they create totally new value chains. They will create a value chain that gives me blood pressure from my AirPods or from my wristwatch, my heart rate. It will integrate with analyzing the kinds of foods that I eat. And they will provide a health service second to none with diagnostic capabilities that are inferred by data that medicine today can't even think about. So let's, I think, try and look at that bigger picture, that actually we could have been wrong about the platform and ecosystem movement. Something completely different could be happening. And once again, what it's going to do is take over other industries. In the case of Apple, it will take over the health industry. In the case of BMW, it will take over large tracts of public mobility, public transport. That, I think, is the interesting trend. And that's why I think it's all about the operating model. If you don't have an operating model that allows you to construct these watches, interface with all the metrics that go on within the health service, a lobbying campaign for this new set of metrics, then you're not going to make any profit anyway.